In September Year A, the Old Testament lectionary Bible readings offer us the story of Joseph forgiving his brothers. He famously says, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." What meaning are we to make of our suffering? Did God plan this, allow it, ordain it? Or is God remixing in real time, making the best of bad situations? How do we understand scriptures about predestination? God's omnipotence and omniscience, he's all-powerful and all-knowing, and God is love, but still, bad things happen. For thousands of years, many Christians and skeptics alike have wrestled with these questions about suffering, pain, and God's plan. I'm Melanie Cave, Managing Director at Roots, and today I'm speaking with Dr Henna Cundill, a theologian, youth worker, minister, and researcher at the Centre for Autism and Theology. She's a regular contributor to Roots, and together we wrestle through these challenging theological questions and reflect on how we can best preach on these passages and pastor people, particularly young people, who are wrestling with these questions. Thanks for joining us on the Roots for Churches podcast. Here we go. Welcome, Henna, to the Roots for Churches podcast. Thanks for being on.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
So we are going to have a theological discussion about the idea of predestination. It came up in the readings, the lectionary readings, and we're actually working through the Old Testament and we're looking at some of the patriarchs. And I think one of the first readings that it comes up in is the idea of Joseph. He's reconciling with his brothers and he says, "What you intended for ill, God has used for good." And I suppose that's not the predestination sort of passages from the epistles that we often think of, but it has this same idea of God's got a plan and what seems bad, God's using for good. And I think Christians take that and apply it in lots of circumstances and settings, but I think it is somehow problematic. It's one of those issues that we get like our minds a bit tangled up around. And I think especially, adults, but especially teenagers as well, trying to figure out what's God's plan for me? How do I make the right choices in education or jobs? How do I know what God's plan is? And what do I do when things go wrong like they do for Joseph? So I think it's a really interesting session, the youth session and the Sunday service about, how do we understand God's plan? Can you give us a bit of a set the scene? How did we get to this understanding of predestination? I'm aware that it's like a historically thing that the church has had lots of arguments about.
Yes, it's a debate that's gone on since the forever times. In fact, for me, I'm not someone who takes the first 3 chapters of Genesis, for example, as like a literal historical account of what happened. So I apologize. I appreciate there may be listeners who do. For me, these are sort of ancient tales. These are the forebears, our ancestors, trying to figure things out theologically by, penning their wisdom onto the page. And what I see in what look like a set of explanations is actually a set of questions, particularly Genesis 3. Why is childbirth painful? Why do we toil the ground as farmers and sometimes there's a drought and the crops don't grow? Why is this so hard?
Yeah.
And same questions that we're kind of asking today. Why are we suffering? Why is human life just not easy? And so you see that the sort of very earliest writers in our faith tradition were already wrestling with these questions. And so perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that several millennia later, we're still wrestling with these kind of questions. And there are certain verses in the Old Testament that get printed on our tea towels and our fridge magnets and our bookmarks and our Bible covers that seem to imply that God has some kind of blueprint for everybody's life. So yes, you've got Genesis 50 verse 20 there, where Joseph is saying, God, you intended this for evil, but God has used it for good, or is intending it for good. You've got Psalm 139, all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And so these do seem to imply, well, okay, God has it all written down. There's a book somewhere in heaven, Henna's life, day one to day, whatever, and everything in there is what's going to happen, maybe. But there are also verses in the Old Testament that challenge that view. So you see that in Exodus 32, Moses appears to intercede on behalf of God's people and change God's mind about what's going to happen. Seems to change God's intention.
He relents.
Same with Abraham in Genesis 18 and so on. So you do get both sides in the Old Testament and awkwardly not together. So you can't, what you see there is, this is not a systematic theology. This is not a book for the library shelf. This is a living document people struggling with these questions right from the get-go, and yet somehow cleaving to God and finding something in following God's way that carries them through a lot of suffering and a lot of trials. So I wonder if there's a distinction to be made to try and simplify the question a little bit as to between saying that God is omniscient, knows everything before it will happen, which we could say absolutely everything or some things, but God's omniscience, God's predestination of things, or God's planning of things, preordaining of things. And then a third thing would perhaps be suffering. And why does God allow suffering? And that's really that question that's there in Genesis 3 that these other two things hinge on. If God knows everything and God plans everything, why is some of it bad? So you've got three things going on there rather than just kind of one, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And as most big problems are, they're never just one thing, are they? There are always lots of things. And if you have a young person or anybody wrestling with these scriptures, their questions about it will not just be in the theoretical. They will be tied to a personal experience. Why has this person got a cancer diagnosis? Why did I not get this job? I thought I was being obedient to God and I have gone bankrupt. Why? Like, I'm doing everything I can to follow God and do my best. Have I somehow missed God's will? Those are, big questions, and they're not theoretical. They're very practical and emotional.
Yeah.
And so we want to know, does God have a plan? And do I have to do something to stay in it? Like, can I get it wrong? Could I fall off of God's one narrow path or plan for me? And then can I get back on? Or is that it? Have I screwed it up for life? And I think we also want to know, like, well, is God going to intervene? Like, is, that phrase that is not in the Bible, but God helps those who help themselves. Like, do I have to do this all myself? Do I have to make all the right choices? Or is God going to guide me, direct me, or almost make it shut all the doors so I can't make a wrong choice? And we have all these questions of, like, how do I get God's guidance? And then, similar to Job, probably, when suffering comes, you start questioning, well, is this my fault? Did I do this? Or is this God punishing me? We have all of these theological questions, and I think they're all wrapped up in this. And I suppose I want to backtrack, because I think when I was a teenager, this phrase predestination, I tended to think about it in terms of salvation only. Or maybe that was the conversation, like, do you really have free will to choose God? Or did God already choose you? And so therefore, that has an impact on evangelism. Like, do we need to do evangelism, or will the right people just sort of find God because he's already planned it? So all of these sort of tricky philosophical, theological questions could come out of a simple story about Joseph reconciling with his brothers.
Yes. And I think you're right when you sort of say, when young people are asking these questions, it's never really in the abstract, or rarely. I mean, sometimes, but if they're asking the abstract, they're usually not too bothered about the answer. And, there have been many, many theological tomes written on these topics. So it's sort of not realistic that we can give a straightforward answer in those situations. But they're asking in the particular. And then, so pastorally for us, that's an interesting thing. Why are they asking? And it's actually a philosopher, Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, who said when people start asking these questions about suffering and what makes somebody able to endure suffering is when it has meaning. People need suffering to have meaning to be able to endure it. So they're looking for it to have purpose or value, or to be part of a larger story. So a lot of what those biblical writers are doing, and especially in the Old Testament, is writing about times of suffering and integrating it into God's larger story as a way to give it meaning and purpose and value, or the purpose and value that mean that it has meaning because it's part of that larger thing. So when we're dealing with a young person who's asking that question in the particular, it's not to just be like, it's okay, it's all part of God's plan, it's all going to have meaning and purpose and value, but actually to let that person come to that understanding themselves of, what does this mean to you right now? What do you think is going on right now? How might this, you didn't get this job, okay, but what might that lead to? Let's start looking forward. And let's start looking at where you've come from and where you're going to go next. So we're not totally stuck in the moment. The moment's important, and I don't want to sort of think, oh, you're not suffering right now because we're going to look at what's going to happen in 2 weeks' time kind of thing. But if we've got to pastor someone through that, then what we need to do is make sure they're moving through and not stuck in that place indefinitely. So whilst offering a lot of compassion for the pain, and real compassion, not fake, also be asking the questions that helps that young person or person to be thinking, okay, where have I come from up to this point? And perhaps more importantly, where am I going to go next? So that this experience starts to have meaning. It starts to be integrated into their larger story. And there, of course, you've got lots of room to be thinking theologically about, what could God do with this? So I think that's a little bit of some of what Paul is pointing to in Romans 8, where he writes about, God works for the good of people, God brings good things out. The problem is that we tend to take that verse and use it as a sledgehammer to bash someone when they're in that moment of pain. And that's, pastorally just horrendous when we do that. We're just trying to move too quickly to meaning and avoid the moment that that person is in. But it doesn't necessarily mean that in the longer term, all these ups and downs and experiences don't become sort of woven into a bigger tapestry of the life we live and the world that we're in.
Yeah, I like what you're saying. It's like that phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And like, if you come to that conclusion yourself, that actually feels very different. Like this, I am strong. I am resilient. I have made it through this suffering. It hasn't killed me. Actually, my faith is stronger and deeper because I have met Jesus in the darkest night. I'm okay. But if you came up to me and said, well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, it minimizes my struggle and rushes me through it and sort of says, well, you'll be fine. And I don't feel seen. I feel shut down somehow or told to just get on with it. And probably what I'm looking for in that moment is somebody to sit with me in the mess and go, yeah, this really stinks. This is really hard. And to grieve with me. And I suppose maybe one of the bigger questions we're asking here is like, what does emotional health look like? And how does that pair with our theology? So if our theology is a bit, well, don't worry about all the suffering now, you'll go to heaven in the end, you end up kind of dissociating from your body and kind of disconnecting from your life here with a fixation on the future. Now, on one level, that could get you through some really tough times. Like our brains do dissociate on purpose sometimes when it's really traumatic. That it is a coping strategy, but that's not a long-term strategy for living. Like you won't be present and alive. So we need to be careful that our theology doesn't give us kind of unhealthy mental health practices.
Yeah.
And so I sometimes worry that, can you have toxic theology? I know you can have like toxic positivity, but like sometimes, or maybe the way theology can be applied in certain settings where it becomes like a platitude or a hurry up and just get over this can feel very unhealthy.
Yeah.
And people, I think in the UK particularly, we're uncomfortable with strong emotions. We don't like it when other people are suffering. We're like, if you could stop feeling that, I would feel less uncomfortable. So can you just hurry up and move out of that? And we give them a Christian platitude or a bit of theology that we think is really deep, or maybe something even that we've been through and where we got to. And it is good, but it's somehow we're rushing them and they've not got to that conclusion themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in this country, I mean, well, we know that in youth culture, Stoicism is seeing a big kind of rise in popularity. And sometimes it gets talked about, oh, the young people of today, they're all adopting Stoicism and this idea that you should just be sailing through life emotionally unaffected by everything happening around you and just on a very, very even keel, very unreactive, very unresponsive to the world, don't let anything get to you kind of thing. And we forget that unconsciously we've fed this to young people over the past few decades with this sort of relentless. I mean, it's important that young people have mental health literacy, that they're able to talk about when they're feeling anxious or depressed or whatever. And we talk about, seeds growth mindset in school and bounce back and resilience and all these things. And these are important, but we've fed it and fed it and fed it and fed it so much that I think what we've inadvertently done is created a generation of young people who think they're not allowed to feel any emotions anymore, or be affected by anything, or feel set back. I mean, the point of bounce back was supposed to be that you come back from a setback. But I think a lot of young people now don't feel like they can acknowledge that they're in a setback place and that they're bouncing back. It's this idea that we've made that a wrong place to be. When you look at the Old Testament, you see this genre called Lament, where people are in despair and they are sitting in despair. And they're still saying, in the middle of the book of Lamentations, you get that his mercies are new every morning. Right in the middle. But before that, absolute despair. And after that, absolute despair. That kind of cycling. And I think when any of us have had an awful thing happen, a bad day, and we've sat and we've cried it out, that's exactly the cycle we go in, isn't it? We cry and we weep and we're telling our friend or our spouse or whatever, and then we make a joke and we laugh for a minute and we're drying our eyes, and then we go back into crying again, and that's a very normal human way of processing emotion. And we see it modeled for us there in the book of Lamentation. But I'm a little bit worried that we have this generation of young people now who think that they can't do that, and that they straight away have to be in their seeds growth mindset, bouncing back, being resilient, using their CBT techniques,
manage your
to
self-talk,
not feel anything, rationalize every emotion quick. And this is Stoicism, and it's always, this philosopher Alistair McIntyre says, it's always where humanity goes when they don't have a kind of clear telos, when they lose sight of their ends. Life becomes about getting through without feeling anything, or as little as possible. And it's not really a very healthy way to be, actually.
So the healthy way to be is to have a healthy view of your future, like a positive thing that you're going to get to. So whether that is heaven, whether that is Christ coming back and restoring the earth, that sort of, or maybe even closer to that, I suppose I'm thinking back to the Joseph story of like, even in all of this mess, God is working somehow, something good. God can weave, not that he wanted the suffering, not that he wanted a famine, but in the midst of this, God can do good things. And so somehow having that end picture gives us meaning. And then that gives us the hope and the resilience to process the emotion in the moment. Is that what you mean?
What it gives us in the moment is a framework for discernment, for looking for God at work. You've got to believe that God's at work to be looking for it. And to be a discerning person is to be kind of assuming that God has something to say to you in any given moment.
Mm.
So I think it's quite key that Joseph, he's at the end of his story in the act of forgiving his brothers when he says, you intended this for evil, but God has used it for good. He's looking back. So he's got to that point where he can understand everything as weaving together as part of a story. He's not in the prison cell feeling completely betrayed and abandoned by absolutely everybody when he says that. So I think that kind of speaks to what you were saying earlier about how somebody has to come to their own kind of moment of saying, it didn't kill me, it made me stronger. Or I don't even know, because sometimes traumatic experiences don't make us stronger, but they also didn't kill us.
They damage us.
Just didn't kill us.
Yeah.
It didn't kill me, but I'm here anyway, kind of thing, which is, I think that's just about okay as well. It didn't kill me, and I'm going to be a strong person when I've gone through my process of healing, is also a fine thing to say.
Yeah, totally.
But so I think it's at having some sense that you are a person with an end, with a future, a hope and a future, as Jeremiah 29:11 says, is something that it's there in the future, but you have it with you in the present to help you just with those everyday, day-to-day decisions that you have to make when you're in a difficult spot and when you're going through suffering. So one thing that happens when we are suffering in any way, just on a neurological level, is that our reasoning and our decision-making abilities are a little bit kind of curtailed. It's just the body's kind of natural defense mechanism. Your prefrontal cortex just is doing a little bit less work, and your kind of body's alarm system is taking over, and people start looking for somebody to have a plan. So you get a bad diagnosis, and you're suddenly, all that matters is what the doctor says the plan is for your treatment process or something like that. You don't pass your exam, you don't get into university, and suddenly you want advice from teachers. You look to other people to start doing your decision making, and that's entirely natural and normal. That's how we're sort of designed to be as human beings. And so, of course, in those dark moments, we also look for God to have some kind of plan. But in order to be able to discern that there is some kind of plan, that there's some kind of way forward out of this difficult situation, we've got to believe that God is there with that ending for the world, and for sort of human history, and that we're part of that story. And that helps us to discern then what God's plan is. So we understand the doctor's plan because we know the doctor is trying to heal us, even if maybe the treatment, if it's something like cancer, might make us feel sicker in the short term. But we trust in the plan because we know where it's going. And, that it's that same kind of knowing where you're going helps you to, as Frankl says, to endure the suffering on the way there, because you've got some sense that there's a value, a purpose, and a sort of story being told in what's happening.
So can we drill down a little bit more onto this idea of God having a plan?
Yeah.
Because there's not like a particular passage that says, this is God's plan. Here it is. I mean, the book of Melanie, here's my book, and here's God's plan. Yeah. But we throw that around in churches a lot. God has a plan for your life. God wants, I'm thinking like, I know the plans I have for you, plan to give you, a future and a hope. He says that to them when they're in exile and they're going to have a few more years of exile. Again, that verse of hope is in the midst of suffering to say, there's something to look forward to. There's something out there that you can cling on to, but it's not going to happen today or tomorrow. But I think there is this, our society really values independence. It values self-actualization, becoming the best you. And there's a Christian version of that as well, which is like, well, God has a plan for you. You need to figure out what that is and become the best you that God made you to do so you can fulfill God's plan for you. It feels like a sort of a mashup of God's plan and self-actualization. Other cultures and worldviews don't have that. They're like, we're here to suffer, or we're here, I don't know. They don't have the same. They don't value independence. They don't value achievement in the Western idealized way that we do. And sometimes I just think we are reading scriptures so much through our cultural lens and so much through these other sort of pop psychologies that then we take these sort of theological doctrines and sort of pop psychology them. And I think this is where I worry that we have young people. I mean, how do you take off the lenses you're wearing? It's very, very hard. But reading scripture through the lens of, as you say, stoicism or resilience theology, or I don't even know if that's a thing, resilience theology. I've just made that up.
Probably it is, yeah.
But that sort of like, or maybe it's also, again, I think this sort of self-actualization, be the best Christian you can be. And on one level, there's so much good in that that you're like, yes, well, you should. But equally, I'm like, where actually is that in the Bible? Like, and are we stitching together things that aren't meant to be stitched together? So I just wonder if you can talk to this idea of like, what does it mean when it says that God predestines all things, or God is all knowing? To what level does he know? Does he know what I'm going to eat for dinner tonight? Does he, or do I have a choice in that matter still? And then I guess that comes back to the conversation about free will. Like, how much can we choose, and where are we drawing the lines with this?
So just some small questions there.
Yeah,
I mean, like, sometimes we get drawn into these things in the abstract, and that's where we wrong foot ourselves. Because as you say, there is no book of Melanie, there's no book of Henna. I don't think at any point really in scripture it's ever explicitly stated that God has a very detailed plan for each individual's life. There are statements made in poetic settings like Psalm 139, all the days were ordained kind of thing, that just sort of says you weren't created by accident. You're meant to be here. But that's not, we now read that in our modern society where it's all about the individual and the self-actualization, as that must mean that every day God had kind of a page in the book, in the diary,
in his day
what
planner,
I was going to be doing. But we're losing sight of the genre of the text there. It's a poem's trade on hyperbole and on these beautiful images. You hem me in and before and behind. Well, I don't see any seams. It's an image. So, but we, as you say, we read these through our contemporary lenses, and we kind of take things from them that maybe don't need to be there and that we've added to them. I think it's very clear throughout Scripture that God has direction, intention, purpose for the world and for humanity within the world, and also that we are each, none of us are created by accident, that we are each here, at God's kind of grace, out of God's grace. I don't think that's the same as needing to believe that God's decided already what you're going to have for dinner. He might know already, that's omniscience. I don't know if we're ever going to know whether or not God is truly omniscient to that level. I don't know if we need to know, but that doesn't necessarily mean that God has already decided what your dinner will be. What we can say theologically, I think, is that God might have an intention for whether or not you're going to have a nice, healthy plate of vegetables and some lean meat or protein and, kind of carbohydrates, or whether you're going to have a McDonald's and then you're then going to chuck the rubbish from the McDonald's in the hedge. Because, I know what you're like, Melanie. But do you see what I mean? It's got that there. We still have the task of discernment within God's intentionality. And we don't necessarily need to believe that therefore there's a clear, like a black and white, there's a right and a wrong thing to have for dinner tonight, but that we kind of take our discerning self into that situation and say, well, okay, we'll get away from the choice of what to have for dinner tonight. But say, a young person has just had their exam results and it's not what they hoped, perhaps, and now they've got to decide on a university place through clearance, or looking for a job, or going and resitting their exams. And that's a situation that's going to face some of our young people in the coming year. At that point, I don't think that young person needs to be hung up on, figuring out exactly what God has picked out of those three options. What they've got to just think about is that God is with them in that decision making, that they can pray for peace, that they can pray for wisdom, that, the God's intentionality is that they're coming to him with that worry, saying, I've got to pick between these three things and I want to be wise and I want to honor you, God. What are my motives for going to university? What are my motives for looking for a job? Are they godly? Am I, living out my identity as a Christian doing this? And those are the kind of questions to be asking, rather than, well, God, is it Aberdeen University or Birmingham? Kind of thing. Yeah. And actually, and you mentioned Jeremiah 29:11. I think that's if you look at that passage as a whole, that's exactly what the passage is about. It's not necessarily the I know the plans I have for you verse that gets pulled out and printed on the Bible cover or on the fridge magnet, but actually the passage as a whole is about the calling of God's people to be discerning in that position of exile, and to be looking for God's kind of voice in the decisions that they have to make as they live amongst people who are engaged in idol worship and practices that are against their own religious kind of.
Yeah. So I guess the question is discernment and decision making. Behind all of this is, like, sometimes we would really like somebody else to make the decision, so it's not our responsibility. Like, just God, tell me what to do. I don't know.
Yeah.
And we can feel overwhelmed, and many of us want to do who wants to do the wrong thing, really? But we want to do the right thing, and we get very hung up on there being only, a pinpoint of right, rather than a whole, acre of right that you could walk into and you could meander around. And we have this idea of a very narrow path, rather than, I don't know, there's a scripture about, follow Jesus on the narrow path and don't take the wide road.
I'm not sure that's what that one means.
No, exactly. But we take these pictures that we've experienced in church and these Bible readings, and we misapply them and say, it's one thing to follow God and choose him for salvation and for, choose to follow Jesus and orient your life that way. It's another thing to feel like you've got to, I'm picturing that clip from Indiana Jones where they have to step on just the right tiles or the whole thing, the whole path collapses under you. And it's like, is it actually that hard to follow God, or is God guiding us? And I think sometimes the concepts behind predestination make it feel like either one end of the spectrum or the other. One end is like, well, God's got it so sorted, you can't get it wrong. Or the other one is, God's got a very specific plan and you have to work really hard to find it. And don't put a foot wrong. And like, surely there's another way to understand this of, it requires you to have agency and discernment, but also God's walking with you in relationship. But that's hard to explain to teenagers or adults for that matter.
I mean, I think you can sort of take the hypothetical example. Say you've got a young person and they've got to choose whether next year they're going to do, biology, chemistry, physics for their next set of subjects. Nat fives in Scotland. What is it? GCSEs in England, isn't it? Or they got to choose art, drama, and social studies or whatever, and they're really worried. What does God want me to pick? How do I know which direction God wants me to go in? Am I a scientist or am I arts and humanities? I just don't know. And I just think that the question that God would be asking at that juncture would be, what version of you are you going to be, regardless of which one you go in? Are you going to be a loving, kind, generous person doing the sciences and doing the arts and humanities, or are you going to be a self-obsessed, narcissistic bully, kind of bitching about all your classmates while you're doing your sciences and your arts and humanities? So I just think, which one does God, where's the discernment there? The discernment isn't really between the subjects necessarily, but between who you're forming yourself to be. And that kind of, in that respect, let's imagine let's say God did have an idea that he wanted you to do the sciences and you pick the arts and humanities. Well, you've done that now, but if you're still striving to be Christ-like and to grow in discipleship and all those good kind of godly qualities, I can't imagine in any way God's going to be like, well, I'm not interested in you now because you picked the wrong subject. So, it's like that's kind of that. What comes first in our worries is perhaps the question there.
Yes. And the nature of us that we tend to fixate again on getting it right, being quick, being efficient, getting there the fastest way possible. We tend not an achievement, achieve young, achieve high, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas maybe God is far more interested in character and the long haul and the how we do it rather than the what.
Joseph's story certainly gives us some inspiration on that score, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, he did rise to great things, but it was not an uncomplicated path. Yeah.
Yeah. And perhaps there's grace in the fact that God didn't tell him how hard the path would be, because we would have backed out. Anyone would. He's like, would you like to spend some time in prison? No, thank you. And, I will opt out of God's plan for my life because, and, you can look back and you can think, well, it taught him humility. It taught him how to be political, all sorts of things that you would never have been able to put in place for himself, living as a nomadic shepherd family in a different country. But God, yeah, it is amazing when you look back, don't you? And I think there is that gift as you get older of seeing God's hand at work as you look back. But I think it's the challenge of looking forward and trying to navigate these decisions, going, I don't know how to make sense of this and I don't know what to do. Please, Lord, make the decision for me.
I guess as well, like, it is okay, I think, to pray for guidance in those moments. And I do think sometimes that guidance does come. I'm thinking of the book of Acts now, where by different turns, as you leaf the pages, you see in one moment, the disciples are praying for discernment about who to pick as the replacement disciple, where to go first, what to do. Is it the right day to sail? Is it not? And then on the next page, it'll be like, well, the weather seemed good for sailing, so we set off or I needed to go and visit, so I set off. So you see the apostles there, Paul in particular, and some of the others, Peter, just making wise decisions based on the wisdom of the day. When's it good to sail? And at other times saying, well, it would be good to sail there, but God is clearly telling me to go to Macedonia or whatever. So you see both things happening.
Yes.
And my point there being that it's not that we never get a little bit of help from God when we need to make these decisions. But I don't know that we need to therefore assume that we can't make any kind of decision just based on wisdom and judgment and advice and from elders and that kind of thing as well.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head there. Is the problem is that, well, God is consistent within himself, but he seems to interact with us differently all the time. So sometimes he's like, here's the person you need. They're knocking on your front door, Peter, and other times they're like sitting around in a prayer meeting trying to discern what to do. And so sometimes God makes it really, really obvious and sort of lines things up for them. And sometimes it seems to be far more of their choice and the slow process of discernment. And I think we want to put God into either or, a slot machine, either or. God will always tell me exactly what to do. And you do sort of read the stories or know people who that does seem to be their experience of their relationship with God, that they seem to have much more of God's guidance, and other people who it's less like that. God sort of seems to say, yeah, I think you'll be fine, whatever you choose. And
I wonder if it's about the stories we tell as well, or when and how we, 'cause I think I've experienced both in my own Christian life, and maybe that's helpful then, in that when I was a very young and fairly new Christian, I felt called to go out on the mission field, which I then did for a year. I was with Operation Mobilization for a year. And that experience of call was so dramatic. That was the sort of being in a Christian gathering, knees going weak, heart racing in my chest, just absolutely thinking, oh, God is telling me to go and do this thing, and I walked out of that meeting and thought, no way, it can't have been God. That was the excitement of the moment. And then by chance, the next week was going to Helsinki to visit my family, and there on Helsinki Harbour was the Logos 2, the mission ship that Operation Mobilization had at the time. And again, knees weak, heart racing, realizing, and it was just such a clear demonstration of God's call. And so I went, and I had a really difficult year. It was the toughest time of my life. It was so hard. And I would have felt that I had got it wrong, if not for the fact that that call had been so dramatic. But by contrast, a few years ago, obviously I'm a more mature Christian now, been around the block a few times. That feeling of call to go back to full-time study, to do a doctorate, to do what I'm now doing, was so much more subtle. It was a confluence of events. It was just these, like the dominoes falling one by one, in ways that I hadn't expected, things coming together in ways that I hadn't expected, but it was so subtle. And yet I kind of just had that sense that, no, I think this is a call from God to go and do this thing. And now looking back on it, I absolutely believe that it was, but such a different experience, and such a different way of being called into something. So I think even in my own life, I've seen both. But of course, the story that I'm going to tell in my youth ministry is the one of being called on the mission field, because it was really obvious. And that's the more simple story to tell.
Yeah. A friend of mine talks about leading lights. It's a nautical term. And basically, if you're coming into a harbour that's very hard to navigate at night, they put lights in a particular pattern so that you can figure out where to go. And then they all line up in a row, and then you steer towards that. And when the lights come out of alignment, you're not going straight and you're going to hit the rocks. And so it is that sense of you're steering blind if it were not for those leading lights that line up. And you have to really trust. You have to really trust that you're not seeing something that's not meant to be one of them. You have to trust the lights, because you really can't see. That's why they've got them there. And I think sometimes that guidance from God does feel like, okay, I'm just going to trust, I'm just going to believe that this is the way you're guiding me. And other times it's daylight, you navigate in, you can see everything yourself, and it makes sense. Yes, I suppose where this all comes back to is trust in the character of God, trust that God is involved, and trust that in the midst of suffering, which God doesn't get rid of, that God is there and God is up to something. And sometimes that's easier to see from hindsight, as we see from these Bible passages. I suppose my other question in that is that how do we help people navigate suffering? Because we don't want to be these sort of overly glib Christians who kind of shut down emotion. We don't want to, in our discipleship and formation, we don't want to encourage too much of this stoicism, and we want a healthy emotional connection. How do we encourage sort of hope and trusting God in a way that doesn't tell people to just kind of, I don't know, stiff upper lip, get on with it, you'll get through this eventually. How do we hold that tension in our discipleship? Because I think the church can get a bit, as you say, fridge magnet. We have these little platitudes that we say, and pastorally that's not helpful. But equally, you don't want to just sit with people in their misery and not offer
definitely
hope.
Yeah. In trauma theology, there's an author called Shelley Rambo who's very helpful on this. She writes about Holy Saturday. And I mean, there's a lot in her work, but one of the sort of key points is Holy Saturday is there, and it was like a whole day. It was a long time that the disciples and the women had this uncertainty about what had happened, what was going to happen before the resurrection appearances started. And that's a dark place to be, and that's a scary place to be. I mean, one of the big passages that people pivot to helpfully and unhelpfully, is, of course, Romans 8, where you have this God working for the good of all those who love him. There's also a lot apparently about predestination in that passage. Again, when you look at the passage in the whole context, you see that what Paul is actually addressing is a theological question about the role of the Gentiles in this new church, and whether or not they are some kind of afterthought. That God's gone, oh no, the Jews aren't all believing in Jesus, I'll bring in the Gentiles as a sort of plan B. So that's kind of the really what's going on in that passage. But that there's still nevertheless things that we can take from that passage that help us to understand a little bit our uncertainty in the present day. Because at the end of the day, Paul is still writing to people who feel uncertain, like, are we in or are we out? Are we plan B? Has God forgotten us? Were we part of the plan? You know, the Gentiles are asking these questions from a place of suffering. And in that, Paul says that he's sure that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor heights, nor depths, nor anything in all creation, nothing will be able to separate us from the love of Jesus. So when you're sort of sitting with that person who's in a really difficult place and going through something horrific, at some point, in some way, in that moment, that unquenchable love of Jesus is being shown to that person. And it might be even just your own presence there with them that is the sign of that. But there will probably be other things in the situation that are signs of that. So one of the questions you can ask that is still staying with that person in the moment, it's not rushing them forward to some future hope, but is also, and is not denying that they're in a dark place, but is also kind of constructive and helping them just to see the chinks of light, is to say, well, we know as Christians, we believe that Jesus's love is not quenched by this. So are you seeing any signs of it anywhere? And, you know, in the wake of maybe a bereavement, perhaps it's reconnection with a relative or a friend of that person that they'd not had a connection with in a long time. You know, in the wake of a diagnosis, it might be the kindness of a nurse or a particular practitioner in the hospital that was just so, you know, strengthening and healing in a moment. And just getting that person to narrate the signs of Jesus's love in their situation can just be a way to have a conversation that leaves room for the pain and isn't, like I say, isn't pushing it out and not giving it airtime, but also doesn't get stuck there in a way that can be unhelpful to someone.
I like that. It's helpful. Because I do think if the Christian faith offers us anything, it is hope in the midst of suffering. Like Jesus, you know, he's the suffering savior. He did rise victorious, but he willingly engaged the suffering and went through it. And so there's something about we're never going to get away from suffering, which is not a very hopeful thing to say. But in the midst of that, we're not on our own, which is probably even scarier. To be on your own in suffering is hard, but to be carried, people with you, knowing that Jesus is with you in your suffering, that's somehow doable. But yeah, it's helpful. If people want to think deeper about this, you've named a few theologians who've helped you. Is there recommended reading that you would point people to, or authors they should look up?
It's a great question. I mean, particularly for youth work, some of the good apologetics comes from Amy or Ewing. I think these are well-known names in the field, aren't they?
Cool. Thank you. Well, I hope that this conversation has brought at least some comfort, if not answers, to some of these questions, but a way to navigate pastorally through what is quite challenging questions individually and as a church. And I hope that the church will be a place where people can ask these questions and be met and be sat with, as it were, as they suffer or as they navigate tricky decisions. Thank you so much for your time, Henna.
That's all right. Good to see you.
Henna has written an article for Roots, which you might want to use in sermon preparation or as a resource for youth leaders, unpacking this whole idea of predestination. Head to the show notes for links. We also direct you to Amy or Ewing's book and one Henna has written in her But Bible Study series for young people on why do bad things happen to good people. At Roots, we believe great church transforms lives and communities, and Roots is here to resource you as you lead that great church. GREAT is an acronym for our values. Church that's growing, relevant, engaging, authentic, and together. We have weekly resources for Sundays, including songs, preaching, intergenerational services, outreach, children, youth, and under 5 sessions, and articles to equip you as you lead, teach, and nurture faith. We're an ecumenical charity, and we partner with the Church of England, the Methodist, the United Reformed Church, the Sunday School Council of Wales, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, the Christian Education Movement, the Church of Ireland, and our newest partners, the Uniting Church in Australia and the Baptist Union of Great Britain. We're proud to have been serving over 11,000 churches across the UK, Ireland, and Australia for nearly 25 years. Head to rootsforchurches.com to find out more or take out a free trial. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, share it with your friends and network, and leave us a review so that others can find it. Together, we can grow.